Hi, everyone, and welcome to our talk webinar today around consumer trends in 2022 and beyond, a global outlook. We'll also be taking a look back at 2020 and 2021 as well. Give people a few minutes to join here, and then we'll introduce ourselves. But we're excited to have you today. On the webinar, you see we have John Last from Sports and Leisure Research Group. I also have Stephen Kraus, Market Research Institute International Director and Star Trek fan as well, I see. So that's always good. There you go. And myself, Dan Fleetwood from QuestionPro. I lead the research and insight space here. We're excited to have you today. We'll be talking about, obviously, 2022 trends, take a look back and see some different trend lines and things that are going on. I know Stephen has a lot of interesting charts and things that he's pulled, so we'll be going over that. And then we'll also be covering, I think, really a tracker that we've run each year from 2022. Of course, when COVID started in 2021, we ran it and released these results at the same time last year. And then we'll also be covering what those results look like now. So we have a few of those different trends. And then John Last will also be speaking around his Back to Normal Barometer that he also launched in late March and sharing some interesting trends there. Just a couple of quick notes here. In whatever format or whatever medium you're viewing this in, whether it's LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, please input your questions. We'll get those and we'll answer those live. I know a lot of you during registration and so forth submitted questions, so we'll be sure to answer as many of those as we can. And I think without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here. I'll be driving the talk today and chiming in when these guys, when I feel like it, I guess. So, Steve, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
You always chime in when you feel like it, Dan. That's
I know.
I love about
it's a problem
you,
of mine,
so.
I suppose. But
awesome. Well, thanks, Dan, for that intro. Thanks, John, for joining, and thank everybody out there for tuning in today. This is always one of my favorite times of year. This is probably the 5th or 6th year in a row that I've done one of these Outlook webinars. And when I was a kid, New Year's was always my favorite holiday. So I love New Year's Eve, and people were making resolutions, and they were looking back at the year that was, and were looking forward to the year to come and making plans and setting ambitious goals for themselves. And one of the things that's really interesting about that is that this is not a new tradition. This has been going on literally for a couple thousand years. The ancient Babylonians used to take the New Year as a time to kind of settle debts and return borrowed farm equipment and things like that. And the ancient Romans did the same thing. In fact, they had a god, Janus, that had two faces, one that looked forward, one that looked back. That name Janus is where we get the name of the month January. And Janus was the Roman god of doorways and beginnings and transitions. And so I always just kind of found that a little inspiring. So we're going to take this opportunity today to take a look back at 2021 and then look ahead at 2022. So Dan, if you want to advance the slide there, we can take a look back first at 2021, and this is not going to be a big surprise to anyone, but 2021 was kind of a cluster. So not a big surprise, but I think if we look at it a little bit more closely, you see there was also a lot of good things that were happening, and so it sort of creates this feeling of chaos and conflict and confusion. Of course, 2021 started off with what many would call an armed insurrection or a coup attempt, or at the very least, inarguably, I think, the first non-peaceful transfer of power we had in this country since 1860. And those kind of concerns continue on, where recent surveys, not just from CNN, because you might see a CNN statistic and say, oh, well, that's biased. There are plenty of surveys that say, well, about a third of the population still believes that Biden didn't legitimately win the election. We've got a majority of Americans, so that's including folks on both sides of the aisle, believing American democracy is under attack. So we've got a lot of chaos, conflict, and confusion just in Washington. Of course, it was a year of new developments on the COVID front. And so, you see that reflected in some of the CDC numbers there, where now we've got, all the chaos and conflict and confusion around Omicron. And that spills over into other parts of life. If you look at the chart on the upper right there, that's the number of FAA investigations into unruly passengers. So you see a huge spike there, up 5 times from what it was in the past. So certainly a lot of things that people are concerned about. On the flip side, stock market up 20-ish% for the year. You look at unemployment, it's really tracking back toward what are kind of historic lows. So, people, I think, are having a lot of problems kind of processing the pros and the cons. And so we'll talk about that from a consumer perspective as we go along. So, Dan, if you want to go ahead to the next slide there. So, as I said, it's, certainly a tough year on a lot of dimensions. But if we look at, as we saw, the stock market was up big. If we look at consumer spending or advertising spending, and those might seem like very different things. In some sense they are, but in another sense, they're also pretty good predictors of economic growth, both of them. There are 3 large ad agencies that produce independent estimates of ad spending for the coming year. And they are all in agreement that ad spending was up big in 2021, round about 15 to 25%. Those are global numbers. If you look more within the US in particular, you see the quote from eMarketer saying digital ad spending is going to blow away our earlier estimates. Certainly a lot of that increase in ad spending is fueled by greater digital engagement by consumers. We all know that, home delivery has gone way up. Digital payments have gone way up. And as you see over on the right, overall consumer spending is going up. So these are government statistics. Obviously, consumer spending took a big hit in Q2 of 2020 as the pandemic hit, just after March when things really started to take off on the pandemic front. But you see the consumer spending has rebounded and is well above where it was before. So I think this further adds to this notion of, wow, so many difficult things are going on. But on the other hand, people are spending, the economy is growing, the stock market is up. And so I think tapping into that sense of conflict and confusion is going to be one of the keys for marketers in connecting with consumers going ahead.
Steve, do you know off chance the typical increase in ad spend year over year? 15 to 25% is a lot, but is it typically 5 to 10%, or do you happen to know that offhand?
I think it's about in that range. So This is significantly ahead of where it normally is. And of course, it took a big hit in Q2, maybe, not as big a hit as consumer spending, because you had so many companies rushing out, of course, with the same ad about how, in these unprecedented times, we're there for you. But certainly this is stronger growth than we've seen in recent years.
Wow, crazy.
Yeah. So that then raises the question, well, how else can we think about what's going on in consumers' lives, and how can we tap into their mindset? And one of the ways that I love to do this is looking at search data, because that's a great sort of, non-conspicuous, unobtrusive way of tapping into what's on consumers' minds. And there are a couple ways we can do this. It's actually not that helpful just to look at the top search terms, because if we do that, and here we've got data from SEMrush, is actually from Q3 of 2021, where we look both globally and at the US at the top search terms, that what we find is that people use Google just as kind of their desktop, basically, and as a way of getting to the sites they go to most often. So I always find it fascinating that the number 4 search term on Google, both in the US and globally, is Google. So people are Googling Google. People Google Gmail. I know I do this. You open up your browser, you want to get to your sites. Some people use bookmarks. Other people, just Google what they're Googling. If you look over on the right at the bottom at the US, you start to see some retail kind of stores. Yahoo Mail may surprise you, but a lot of people still use Yahoo Mail. So just looking at the overall top search terms is not maybe the most insightful way to go in terms of trying to understand what's on consumers' minds right now. But if we go to the next slide, we'll look at, and these are data straight from Google Trends, on what are the top trending search terms. And I just find this so fascinating. I could look at these numbers for a long time. So you see, if you just look at globally searches overall, you see, big global cricket tournaments, which John would probably know more about than I would. My favorite stat is globally, if you look at news searches, that's the middle column, the #1 term globally is Afghanistan. In the United States, it's mega millions, which says a lot about the American mindset. John, what do you make of these numbers?
It's always fascinating to see where this comes from. And I think one of the big themes that I'll talk about, both domestically and globally, is just how divisive, how dichotomous and fragmented. We've talked for years about the segment of one and micro marketing, but in these times of misinformation, of conflicting information, there's just so many different ways that people are, different priorities that different people are putting on things. So I'll get into that a little bit in some of our barometer findings, but I agree with you, Steve. I think looking at this is it's fascinating to just see where people's attention is going, and I think that kind of segues into where you were going to show next, which was a really fascinating look at how people's attention spans aren't necessarily that long.
Yeah, Dan, did you have any comments or snarky insights on this one before we go on?
Yeah, my interesting thing is, it's funny when you think back of the year, and you can think back each of these news stories or things that happen. Obviously, some are tragic, but some are a little bit more tongue in cheek. Like I think the AMC stock and then the Dogecoin, you can see that. But then it's interesting to me around just the people and the search terms there. Like I think back to, Tiger Woods, obviously, with, the Masters, and then he also injured his knee. So it's interesting that, like, these names are so, I think, ingrained in people's minds that it's interesting that they're searching for them. But when you look at the differences between the searches, between the global and US, there's some, I would say, similarities, but interesting that a lot of the global searches are around, sports, which I think is interesting, John, that you have that global aspect, where the US, it's not. I think it's maybe a little more trivial, people would say.
Yeah, I think also that, from a sports standpoint, and gosh, I can pontificate on this for hours, but, it sounds trite, but the barriers have come down even further. We're in the middle of Olympic years, and just with the proliferation of media coverage, I think globally and in the US, there's just been more of an outward appreciation and pursuit of sports. Definitely something we've seen in recent years, where people are a little bit more insular a decade or so ago.
Right.
Yeah, and I think people are spending more time at home. They're looking for entertainment. They're looking for a little bit of escapism, maybe, from all the conflict and chaos going on, and that certainly drives people towards sports as well.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah.
Well, why don't we go to the next slide, which actually highlights something that we both hit on. This is from Axios, and every year they do one of these where they look at the top news stories of the year, and they also use Google Trends, and the way they look at it is they look at all these different news stories, and they look at kind of when did they peak, when did they hit, and this chart here, and it's a fascinating chart. You can click on the link there and go check out the whole thing. This is just the first month of the year. These were all the different news stories that peaked during this time. And I think this adds to the feeling that people have of kind of a sense of exhaustion. I know, John, you're going to talk more about people and their sense of isolation right now. But I think it's like, every week there's a new story, there's a new crisis, there's new, some new celebrity is disappointing us in some way. I think it's just driven the sense of exhaustion that people have. But I think we'll also shed light on some of the other trends we're going to talk about.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that Donald Trump is still in the news here. Obviously, with what happened at the Capitol in January, maybe that spurs some of it. But I think people are talking more about that than you see, like Joe Biden, down there and so forth, and Kamala Harris. But it's interesting that he's still this, present, even though he's seemingly, been gone for a year.
Yeah, and the other thing to keep in mind about these numbers is these are from Google Trends.
Sure.
There are a lot of things that people don't Google. And so, like you won't see, COVID necessarily as a huge story in this kind of metric, because people aren't necessarily Googling COVID. Another big trend, of course, is kind of the media bubbles that people live in. And, the liberals are going to go look to CNN and the conservatives are going to go look to Fox News. And,
right.
People may already have their news outlets that they go to that won't go through Google. But I think this general sense of it's a constant barrage of story, problem. Now it's the supply chain, and now it's this, and now it's that. It's
it's fleeting. I think when I first saw this chart, I know Steve, you and I and Dan were talking about it. You look at these things peak, it's like a week or two, and then it's gone. You come back in another format. But people's ability to focus on certain things, they're few and far between. And again, we'll get into that. Some of what we've been tracking through the back to Normal Barometer really looks at, some interesting shifts in people's perspectives on some more of the macro issues. But, what always captivated me about this particular analysis was just the quickness with which people move from one thing to the next.
Right, right.
Sounds good. All right, well, let's move on. And just, kind of pulling back now to the U.S. specifically and thinking about where is the consumer mindset. Pollsters have been tracking these kinds of things for a long time. A lot of times they'll use, what's called a right track, wrong track measure. And we used one of those in the latest survey work that we did with QuestionPro, showing about, 3/4 saying that things are going in the wrong direction, about 1/4 saying things are going in the right direction. And you can kind of see the longer term trend there and how it's gone up and down. But if you just focus in on the last year, I mean, look at the volatility there. Like we've not seen this level of volatility in terms of how things are going over a short period of time. 45% say, yeah, things are going pretty well, down to 11% and back up. Just a tremendous amount of volatility.
Yeah, look at that. You look back into, where it was the 7 there in 2008, 2009. I mean, that was the mortgage crisis and everything going on, right? And then now, obviously almost back to those record low levels, I think, through COVID.
Yeah,
so it's interesting.
I'll show some sentiment, which we do in the barometer, but I mean, just looking at new data that came in that didn't make it in this presentation, comparing it to a year ago. I mean, this, I don't want to date myself, but I heard Jimmy Carter's Malaise speech in 1976, and I'm fearing we're going to hear another one.
Yeah, that was a classic low point in kind of American sentiment. You also see things pretty high in 99, 2001. Of course, 2001, after September 11th, there was kind of a tremendous rallying around the president from people of all different political persuasions.
Yeah.
But even if you go back to 99, the stock market was going well. There was all this excitement about new kinds of technology. You had the government functioning relatively well together compared to today, where now it's just like, it's huge government debt, government dysfunction, inflation, COVID. It's so many things driving that volatility that we see today.
Yep.
All right. So that's kind of our look back at 2021, for better or for worse. Now let's go ahead and look ahead to the future. Niels Bohr, a famous physicist, once said, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. I know when I was a kid, I was always asking my dad about, what are we going to do tonight? What are we going to do tomorrow? My dad would always say, if I could predict that, if I could predict the future like that, I'd be at the racetrack. But having said that, if we go to the next slide, some people have successfully predicted the future really, really well. And you might be familiar with this quote from Carl Sagan from a book that he wrote called The Demon Haunted World. He wrote this book in 1995. This particular quote sort of became famous recently when Brian Williams of NBC retired. And he read this quote, and I won't read the whole thing, but you really see a very powerful sense of, in 1995, Carl Sagan with a good sense of where the country is going. He said, I have a foreboding of an America in my children or grandchildren's time when the United States is a service and information economy, spot on. When nearly all the manufacturing industries have slipped away to other countries, spot on. Awesome technological powers are in the hands of very few, spot on. No one is representing the public interest can even grasp the issue, spot on. When people have lost the ability to set their own agendas or knowledgeably question those in authority. And I'm going to go ahead and skip over to the other side. And he talks about the dumbing down of America is most evident in the slow decay of substantive content in the enormously influential media. The 30-second sound bites now down to 10 seconds or less. What is it now? Look at TikTok. Look at all the misinformation that's out there. So for a quote from 1995, this is remarkably spot on.
No, I think it's interesting. And even, it's funny when you're in college, they tell you to write like 10, 20-page papers, and now everybody wants things in a page or less, right? So it's kind of interesting that kind of parlays to this. But I think, Steve, what people want to know, can Carl Sagan help those predictions with the Mega Millions numbers? Can he help out with those?
I think back to your dad. I mean, you talked about going to the track. One of the sports that really began to grow in its popularity during the pandemic was actually horse racing. And part of what we've concluded on that was the fact that it was one of the few sports that didn't have any interruption. It enjoyed, some time alone. But more on that later.
Interesting. I didn't realize that. Yeah, we'll get more into that. Yeah, cool. All right, well, let's go on. And you can kind of click through the animations here. So what we did, and we, mostly being QuestionPro, and so they've been tracking different kinds of consumer sentiment over the past couple of years. And so one of the ways that they did that was to ask people on a 10-point scale, how are these different aspects of life going? And we had 6 different personal aspects of life, and we'll show those in more detail in a little bit. But it's things like, how is your personal life going? How's your family life going? Things like that, as well as 6 aspects of culture or society. How is the job market? How's the stock market? How are things going in America as a whole? And we did the survey back in July 2020. So remember, March 2020 was when the pandemic really first hit. By July 2020, people were still watching Tiger King and The Last Dance and baking bread and doing all that kind of stuff. And in July 2020, we asked people, well, how do you think things are going to be by the end of next year, meaning by the end of 2021? And people said, things are going to be going really well. We're going to get through this, this pandemic. This will be a few weeks, couple months, maybe. And now if we flash forward to the data that QuestionPro collected in January of 2022, so just earlier this month, well, not a big surprise that, things got worse, not better. But then what's really interesting is our future expectations are really tempered. So now we ask, how do you think things are going to be going by the end of 2022? They're kind of feeling that, oh, you know what, we're going to be lucky just to break even with where we were back, just after the pandemic started. So Dan, if you want to go ahead to the next slide, we'll just kind of put some numbers around this real quickly. So these are for the 6 personal aspects of life that we ask about. And again, we'll show those in more detail, but it's like, how is your life going, your family's life, your job, your career, your finances? And you see, when we asked this back in July 2020, on a 10-point scale, people were averaging a 6.9, so still, reasonably high. And we said, how are things going to be going by the end of next year, 2021? A big jump up to 7.6 was the expectation. Now, January 2022, we asked them, how are things going? 6.5, so even worse than things were, a year and a half ago. We say, well, how do you think things would be going at the end of this year, meaning the end of 2022? See, basically, just a little bit lower, or maybe breaking even with where we were July 2020. So these are the these are the personal aspects of life. Maybe if we go to the next slide, we'll see the exact same pattern. We ask about how are things going in society. So again, that's job market, stock market, America as a whole, race relations, things like that. Again, same pattern. Everything's a little bit lower. People have always felt that things are going better in their own life than in the country as a whole. Sometimes we call that bifocal optimism. But you see, July 2020, how are things going in society? A 5.1. How are things going to be going in a year? Oh, much better. A 1-point jump on a 10-point scale. Whereas now, how are things going? Not that great. And how are things be going by the end of the year? Hopefully a little bit better than it was what will then be 2.5 years ago. So,
yeah,
Dan?
It's interesting. I wonder if it's tempered expectations or being more realistic, right? And in some of these where now you've lived through, COVID for a year or two, you kind of know that it's going to be hard to predict things, right? So if I can get just a little bit better, things are going to be better off for me. So it's interesting that now that it's been around and the perceptions have probably changed a lot, as the data is showing.
Yeah, I'll show a slide a little bit later. We've been tracking kind of when people feel that we're going to be going back to pre-pandemic normal, whatever that means.
Interesting.
And what's fascinating about it and kind of disturbing about it is that window just keeps moving out further and further every time we ask.
Interesting.
Yeah. So we obviously won't go through every number on this slide, but this is all the data that went into those previous 2 slides. And so you can see all the measures we use in terms of, personal aspects of life and these societal, cultural aspects of life. I think the one thing that I might call out is, how is your, professional life going? And how do you think that the job market is going? Because there's so much talk about the great resignation. Now people are kind of calling it the big quit. And it makes it seem like, oh, well, everybody's career is going great. And people are just, working from home, and people are quitting all over the place because so many people are hiring. and the data suggests attitudes are a little bit more tempered on that. And I think the caveat that I would add to that, it really kind of depends on your own economic standing and the kind of job you have. If you are a knowledge worker, like all of us here as panelists and probably many people on the call, then yeah, there probably are a lot of job opportunities. And yeah, you can work from home. But if you're working at Walmart, if you're working at an Amazon warehouse, your perspective on the job market is probably very different.
Interesting.
We'll get into that too, just in some work that we've done with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce on what the behaviors and attitudes are of those who have left their jobs during the pandemic. So I'll get to that in just a minute. But
awesome.
It's always great when so much corroborates itself. I mean, one of the fascinating things for me this year as a researcher who, we focus obviously on the sports and leisure sectors, but we also move into other areas, and through the barometer, it's just the confluence of all this information just kind of feeds an overall perception of what's going on. And hopefully those on the call are getting a sense of that, because this data that you've been presenting, Stephen, is just a great prelude to that.
Excellent. Well, let's plow ahead. We have a few more attitudinal measures that we look at that, sort of corroborate a lot of what we've seen already. So we've asked a couple of forced choice questions. What are you more worried about, coronavirus or the economy? And you've seen it was about 60-40. Now it's about 50-50. I think that's not a huge change given everything that's gone on. And then we asked some questions that, again, the wording may feel a little bit more, March 2020. Social distancing and stay-at-home orders are, an overreaction versus necessary to save lives. You see basically no change in that. And so I think, we've got a couple of different segments in the population. You have kind of more of what you might call a science-driven or health care-driven segment, and another segment based a little bit more on, not so much on scientific data, but more on intuition and more of a sense of the importance of independence and doing your own thing. And those two segments, I think, have stayed relatively stable in size.
Yeah, what's interesting here is the coronavirus and the economy, like that gap really shrunk. I mean, now it's essentially 50-50. People care about both more, where you see the coronavirus was definitely more of a concern than the economy. So kind of interesting there.
Yeah, very, very interesting that, as I'll show you in a minute, people have kind of moved back into behaviorally things that they tried to do before. They aren't necessarily enjoying them as much. And that cloud and pall of all of the virus still lingers over their heads. So it's a very, there's a lot of conflicting aspects that are impacting how people behave versus how they feel.
Interesting.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's plow ahead. Just a couple of other attitudinal items that I think really reflect how profound people's concerns are about the direction of the country. 3 out of 4 essentially saying the founding fathers would be very disappointed with the condition of America today. The American dream has become very difficult to achieve. It's harder than ever before to achieve. And on the flip side, you've got fewer people saying, what, I've gotten used to all this. And you've only now got 20% believing in what historically has been a fundamental tenet of the American dream, that young people today will be better off than the generation that came before them. So I think it really speaks to just how profoundly concerned, and like you said, John, that phrase of malaise from the late 1970s, I think is back. Yeah. So, one of the final things that I would add is, if I tried to put this all together in my head, where is the consumer mindset at right now? I would kind of use the notion that people are grieving, that we kind of thought 6 months ago, 3 months ago, oh, the vaccines are here. This is the beginning of the end. We can see the light at the end of the tunnel. And psychologist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is famous for her 5 stages of grief. And you can go through every one of those stages and see exactly kind of how the consumer mindset has changed, from the initial denial of, this isn't going to be a problem, to anger about the situation, to kind of a bargaining sort of sense. Oh, maybe if I do this, I just stay home, I can sort of, stay out of the way of this thing, to kind of a feeling of helplessness, and I can't do anything about this, and kind of a lower mood and a depression, to kind of where we are today, which is where I think kind of a sense of acceptance. that, COVID's going to be part of our lives. We're going to have to move on. I'm going to have to move plan. There's maybe not going to be a post-COVID world. There's going to be a life plus COVID world. And the other thing that I would really point out for brands is if you look on the very bottom of that graphic that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross pointed out, what it is that people really need at these different stages. So when they're first hit with, grief or, a terminal illness diagnosis, they're looking for information and communication. And then as they move through the process, they're looking for emotional support. And now, as people are moving into kind of these new life stages, hey, I got to move on with my life. How am I going to navigate that? They're looking for direction and guidance. And I think that's a real opportunity for brands, just in terms of a communication point of view, to be able to come out and say, hey, you're rethinking your life. You're developing new habits and new patterns, and we can help you in this way and that way. I think that's the kind of messaging that would really hit home today.
Spot on, Steve. It's so reflective of a lot of the qualitative work that we've also done around the pandemic. And the other term that I think really applies well to brands is control. Who's providing a scenario that is going to enable people to feel that they can control their outcomes and have an experience that meets them at their level of readiness, whatever that may be. We've seen that quite a bit in some of our resort and gaming clients who have really sought ways to get back. I mean, I feel bad. We did a lot of work with the movie theater industry in the early stages, and they had this whole plan to kind of, the Cinema Safe program, which we kind of helped inform. It was harder for them to do that. So, on a sector by sector basis, there's a real wide gap in who can provide that feeling of comfort and safety. And for some, it's very different than others. I as one who does a lot of traveling and just recently got back from the wilds of South Florida and now back in New York. I mean, you can immediately see just the variation in how things go down. The best illustration of it was during a week in November. I was in Dallas, Texas for 3 days, and then in Southern California. And in Dallas, I remember going into a crowded sports bar and feeling almost for a moment like things were back. And later in the week, I was in Southern California, and I was standing 6 feet away from a plexiglass divider while a hotel worker worked the buffet line for me at breakfast. Just two totally different Americas, which has been a real theme of what we've been seeing throughout.
Yeah. It's interesting, Steve, when you first put this, graph up and compared it to COVID and the stages of grief. I think I'm probably like most people that are listening to this now and thinking back to their experiences and sort of, if you look back to March of 2020 and the different stages that you've gone through, it kind of think back to different moments. So yeah, really interesting. And John, you're right. I think depending on where you go, the differences are just astounding between, is COVID still here? Is it not? The different measures different states are taking, even different cities for that matter. So
it's really fascinating. And this is a great example of it. I mean, I think I went through all 5 stages, back in March of 20. I was out at the Pac-12 basketball tournament during that. We went from, really, they're not going to make the fans not come the next day to, oh my gosh, the tournament's going to be canceled.
I know.
It's Canada, literally, 24 hours.
So true.
Horrible to live through.
Yeah.
which kind of leads to where I want to jump in with some of what we've been tracking with the Back to Normal Barometer. For those unfamiliar with it, this is a regular study that we've been doing since the onset of the pandemic. We kind of felt that it was important to kind of understand what it was going to take to get people to come back and how their behaviors and attitudes were going to meld. We've been doing this. We did it weekly throughout much of 2020. And then moved to a monthly basis in March of 21. So you can see on this particular chart, one of the things that we asked people about, first of all, everybody in the study has participated actively in a variety of different leisure activities, before the pandemic. So these are people that were very much ones who wanted to self-actualize. And we've asked them, over time, for each of the activities that you engaged in prior to the pandemic, where are you? Have you participated in it within the last 30 days? And if you're not, how likely are you to participate in it without any hesitation? And it's pretty easy just to look at the arc of this particular slide to see where we've come from back in March and April of 20 on the far left, where about a third, this is the average of all the activities and all the people, to where we've really been over the last several months. So despite this malaise, this pervasive concern that you'll see in a few moments is still there, people are getting on and doing things. It's, do as I do as opposed to as I feel. And that has real implications for marketers because in some cases they're going at it reluctantly. But you can see that the average person, 92% of them, have either engaged or are willing to do so without hesitation for a variety of these activities, everything from flying on an airplane to staying in a hotel, going to a bar, going to a sporting event, visiting the doctor or the dentist. I mean, we track about 14 different activities on this. And again, this is about as linear a line graph as one could see. So that's something that's been a real interesting phenomenon that we've observed. On the next slide, I want to talk about something that I think is really an interesting trend that's not going away. And something that we have really, as you can see on this is the whole aspect of stay-at-home work and hybrid work scenarios. And you can see the three different segments. We ask people, what are you doing? And you can see that while there has been a nice uptick in the yellow section of these bars of those who have gone back to full-time at the workplace, it's about a third split between those who are doing that, those who are working in a hybrid situation, and those who continue to work strictly from home. And with Omicron and the most recent uptick in reported cases of COVID, we have seen that tick upward to about a third who are working at home. And that really is an intriguing component. We'll talk about time in just a few moments, but it's really kind of, you talk about the Great Resignation, you talk about people's attitudes about work and work-life balance. You've got 2/3 of the population now that's spending their work life in a very different way than they did just 21 months ago. So I'll hold that thought for a moment because I'll show you how that manifests itself in some perspectives that we've also developed about how people are spending their time and what that means for different products, services, and activities that they want to participate in. Any comments from you guys as you look at this trend?
Yeah, I think this is spot on. The only caveat that I ever try to add to this is just it might be a little bit different if you're looking at the tech giants. I'm out here in San Francisco. Google, Facebook, Apple, they're going to try to get people back into the office as quickly as they can. Google in particular has been investing heavily in real estate. These are companies that spend millions of dollars every year providing their employees, the best fresh cooked catered food they can, because they don't want them taking 30 minutes for lunch to go across the street to get a sandwich. So I think the big tech giants are really going to put the pressure on people back in the office. There's so much interest among highly skilled young tech workers to work there that they're going to be okay with that, and the office is a big part of their social life. So I think it'll be a little bit different out here in San Francisco, but I think nationally you've captured the trend very well.
So let's talk about the other big elephant in the room, which is the economy and inflation. And this is something that we've also been tracking for a good part of the latter part of this year as inflation became more of an issue. And certainly the empirical data is out there. You can look at it, whether it's U6 unemployment or just consumer pricing as a whole. And you can see here that the big trend as you look again at these shapes of these particular bars is the yellow and the blue are perceptually the people that feel that they have seen consumer prices somewhat or significantly higher than what they were before. And those bars have risen to an all-time high, 71% in January, just a week ago, saying that they see these prices as being somewhat higher or much higher by the yellow and blue bars. And interestingly, the travel sector has lagged a little bit. The travel sector here, you can see the bottom, those are saying much higher. It has peaked up a little bit as we went into the holidays, but it has kind of lagged behind consumer items. I think the main takeaway here, though, is that there is just this perception, driven by reality, that people are paying more for things. And that's something that, again, looking at some of the other data that we just got from the most recent wave of the barometer, has not gone away. So let's talk about the Great Resignation on the next slide. Let's talk about what people are doing during the pandemic, those who've lost their jobs during the pandemic. If we move to the next slide, we've got, we were fortunate enough to do some work in May and just recently with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. They've posted the full findings of this study up on their website, and I'm happy to provide it to others that want to get it more readily. But we did a very specific study of a survey of those who had lost their jobs during the pandemic to find out what they were doing. And this one particular slide, I think, is a really, very vibrant illustration of the fact that a lot of folks who are out of work aren't necessarily rushing back to try to find something new. This is the percentage of people who are strongly somewhat or not very or not at all active in looking for a job at the current time. And obviously, we saw a little bit of an erosion of this data from May through the most recent, as some of the stimulus payments have gone down. But you can also see on this particular slide how it varies. Certainly some sectors of the population are much more actively seeking a new job versus others. One other point not reflected on this slide that I think is really important to call out, and one that I think you guys alluded to, in the service sector is where you see it most acute. And you see in that sector, in a separate question that we asked, I think we saw upwards of a quarter of those folks who said that they were definitely going to be looking in a different industry than where they're coming from. So the labor shortage that has so plagued a lot of folks in service and hospitality is not necessarily a pain point that we see going away in the short term. Let me move, unless you guys have some other comments on this, let me move back to the comment I made before about time. Because I think one of the really interesting phenomena from the pandemic, both through this new transformation of how people work, has given us a greater understanding of time. When you think about it, before the pandemic, people were really seeking more time to do the things that they love. And in the early stages of the pandemic, it was the exact opposite. People were looking for things to fill their time. And here you can look at the percentage of folks who agree strongly in blue and still agreement in gray. All over 50% who agree that the impact of the pandemic has really given them a greater focus on how they spend their time. They have greater flexibility. They've learned how to better manage their time. They have more leisure time available to them, and they're able to really see the split between in the workplace, in a dedicated workplace or working at home, has been a positive outcome. So again, as we think about it, and the CEO of Blackstone had some quotes this morning that I saw about really having a focus on the employee and their needs. You couple that with what we just showed you in terms of people's behaviors, in terms of more selectivity, more of a buyer's market than a seller's market. And this is really going to have some profound impact, at least in the short term, on how we treat our employees and how we are mindful of time. It's so hard for me to conceive, and I think you guys feel the same way. We grew up in a juncture where, even before I had my own company, I was always of the mindset that I've got to act like I own this business. That's what I was always looking to. What did I need to do to get ahead? What do I need to do to be successful in what I'm doing? And you couple some of this data with some of the qualitative that we've done, particularly with some of the younger generations, and it's a very different orientation. And it's one that, frankly, I have a tough time personally getting my arms around because it's not consistent with the value system that I grew up with. But it's here, and it's a reality. And I think the more we acknowledge and embrace that, the better productivity we're going to get out of our workforce. Guys?
John, do you think that a lot of this is attributed to people working from home and therefore they don't have as long of commutes? Like if you're spending an hour in the morning, hour and a half to get home, obviously that frees up, 2.5 hours of your day to maybe do more leisure activities. Do you attribute it to that or something else?
I think that we learned to do that during the times when people were at home. I mean, the perfect example of one of the sectors that we work very extensively in is golf. And golf, which for the past 5 years prior to the pandemic was kind of stagnant and people were questioning its long-term viability, has seen a huge increase in participation. And some of that has been 9-hole rounds. People can get out early. People can get out, people can work when they need to and want to, and be flexible in how they're spending that other amount of time. I mean, again, I hate to be a sample of one, but I just got back from a month in Florida. I played more golf in the last month than I would in 3 Januaries together if I wasn't living there.
Yeah. I think there's a fascinating point about how people are rethinking about time. The phrase that I sometimes use and what I'm seeing in people is pay yourself first. And that's a phrase that kind of comes from personal finance and the notion of, take some money out of your paycheck and put it into an investment. And, before you even get the chance to spend it. So that, it's paying yourself first. And I think people are now increasingly doing that with their time. They'll wake up in the morning, like you're saying, Dan. Oh, I don't have to, drive an hour. I don't have to maybe, shave as often or as carefully as I used to. And people say, so I'm going to get up now and I'm going to do things for me. I'm going to go run. I'm going to go, spend time with my kids, whatever it might be. I think people are paying themselves first and really reallocating their sense of time and how they use it.
Yeah, I think this is a good thing. And there was a comment around, work-life balance is ultimately the best way to improve productivity at work, and I think this is attributive to that. So that's really interesting.
Interestingly, though, and it goes into the next particular slide, at the same time that we're doing that, I think we have to be careful and mindful that we aren't back yet. And what I mean by that is, as people have returned to these activities, think about that slide that I began with, we've also seen a consistent dynamic that for a pretty significant percentage of people, and you can see the numbers on this slide, a lot of these activities that people coveted during some of the more restrictive parts of the pandemic have not delivered. So if you can break through and create that experience, create that control, create that recollection of what it was like, you're so far ahead of the game because a number of these different factors, a number of these different activities are under-delivering. And you can see here on the slide some of the bigger ones. And, on the bottom of the slide, when you look at people, not necessarily as apt to go out to eat. The restaurant sector has been decimated. And, you've got nearly a third of people, nearly a quarter of people still who say very strongly that they agree that this has not been really enjoyable as they remember. It kind of translates to something else we've been tracking on the next slide, which is a really interesting dynamic. We created something that we call COVID liberation moments. And really what that was defined as was a moment in time where people actually felt that personally they had gotten their pre-pandemic life back in some meaningful way, either temporarily or permanently. And you can see as you go through and track this, the summer, we were with our summer vacation, right? We were all going to be liberated by the time, we got to July 4th, and people started to feel that way in June, but it didn't deliver. And it is, if you look at the numbers in November and December, it's gone down to under 4 in 10 who say that they've had this COVID liberation moment. And on the right-hand side, the other thing that's really interesting, and this is data that just came back, so it's not reflected on the slide, the percentage who say permanently is now at an all-time low, because for some, the COVID liberation moment could be fleeting, right? I went to a ball game for the first time in a year. Yeah, I didn't have as good a time, and now I'm back to where I was before. So that permanently number of those who had a COVID liberation moment shows that for a lot of them, they don't see it as something that's long-term, which again, I think is really important as you think about how your products and services can deliver a sense of normalcy, really provide, that same actualization that people enjoyed prior to the pandemic. And that brings
John, I love that, the COVID liberation moment. That's a super smart way to think about it. I think, in a couple of years, everybody will think back and ask people like, what was your COVID liberation moment? And they'll think back to the specific point in time you mentioned. So that's really interesting.
Thanks. Yeah, well, so it kind of brings us, I think that we're going to wrap up now with a few thoughts on the years ahead. I know we want to leave some time for people to ask questions and us to go through those. So if we jump now to where we're going in 22 and 23, the next slide really kind of echoes what Steve just shared a few moments ago and what the work that we all just did together has. But I think there's some really, not to beat a dead horse in terms of people's concerns, but if you look at, these are some statements that we've been asking in the barometer from the onset that really showed some hesitation as we move into the new year. People less happy, seeing others around them being less happy, down 10 points from October. People not feeling as if they or the country as a whole or their neighbors are better off. And these numbers get even worse because, again, I just looked at the January set that came in. People not necessarily seeing free spending on luxuries or having the confidence that they can retire in comfort. And then this whole sense of isolation, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment, that kind of comes out of this. As well as, one just about, are we going to be able to build back better? And this was kind of prescient in the sense that we asked this question right before Joe Manchin indicated that he was going to not go along with that. But the point being here, again, just to kind of add fuel, unfortunately, to the fire of the earlier slides, is that people really had a lot of concerns at the end of the year, where historically, and some of the other work that we've done over the years, the end of the year is that time where people start gearing up for, hey, it's going to be better. I'm going to make my New Year's resolutions and keep them this year. And in this case, they weren't even ready to do that. And it kind of transcends in some other areas. Steve, I know you've got a couple of things to look at in terms of investment and care, and then I'll kind of come back with a couple of other interesting observations before we go to questions.
Yeah, so I'm just going to go through this real quickly. So we did ask some questions about investment outlook, and basically you've got 3/4 of the population say, my investment approach is going to stay the same. we ask about, well, what do you think about these different kinds of investments? What's good? What's not so good? And basically, there's a lot of, lack of differentiation. People say, yeah, everything's kind of about the same. And basically, that's a luxury that people can have when the stock market's at 35,000. And if it goes down to 25,000, I think we're going to see a very different kind of mindset. So sometimes I'm kind of asked, what sort of canary in the coal mine metrics do I look at that might signal a big change? And, the stock market continues to be just on a great, great run. And I keep a close eye on the stock market, because if that starts to turn around, we might see a lot of changes in consumer behavior. So, yeah. And if we just go ahead on to the next slide, and I'll move through these quickly. But we ask a whole bunch of questions about, what are you going to do more of in the next year? What are you going to do less of? And then we kind of take the percentage of people who say they're going to do more minus the percentage of people who say they're going to do less. So it's kind of like a net promoter score. So if you're familiar with that. And so we just kind of broke those into some broad categories. And, people are feeling they're going to do a lot more of those kinds of like traditional sort of New Year's resolution kinds of things, self-care, eat healthy, spend time in enjoyable ways and so on. The difference is, I think that with everything going on in COVID, and as people are rethinking their time, as John talked about, I think there's probably a greater chance that people might be able to execute on those kind of classic aspirations that people have in the new year. It'll look differently. Historically, every year there was a big boost in gym membership at this time of year, and we're probably not going to see that this year, but exercise in different ways might happen. And the same kind of thing with spending. People saying they're going to spend more on groceries, personal care, wellness, less on restaurants. I think that fits in with that same general pattern as well.
It's interesting that meet new people is stable, even given, with COVID and everything. It maybe is the sign that like things are starting to get back to normal. People are accepting things, but meeting people is interesting to me that it's stable. The other ones, like you mentioned, are kind of maybe seasonality. Like this is the time of year when people make those resolutions and so forth. But that was interesting. And the interesting negative thing here is spend time on social media. That's something that people want to do less than, Steve? Is that what that is?
Yeah, and we'll see if that comes to pass. But certainly social media has gotten a lot of negative publicity. Whether or not that translates to how individuals actually act, things like less time on social media, less time on kind of superfluous celebrity news, stuff like that. We'll see. That's a common aspiration that's often not followed through on, and we'll see if that happens.
It's easy to go back to social media, right? And the doom scrolling and everything else.
There you go. Well, I got a new phone. I made a special effort not to put social media apps on it.
I like it.
I don't know if I might be alone on that.
Can you give us an update in a couple months here, Steve?
Yeah, exactly. John, what's your take on isolation?
So a couple of quick things. Isolation was something that I touched on for a second on a slide ago, but this has really jumped out in recent months. When you look at total agreement, not just strong agreement, 59% of respondents agree with the statement compared to before the start of COVID. I feel more isolated from the world around me. And I think this is really a profound thing to explore, because if you think about the silos, the echo chambers that everybody is kind of living in, they've become more critical as we don't necessarily have the same level of water cooler chat, the same level of actual personal interaction. So, in thinking about this in conjunction with some of the qualitative work we've done, we're just seeing how this sense of isolation is leading to mistrust. It's leading to, really a lack of and a redefinition of what a social opportunity is. I mean, if you think about it, depending upon whether you're working in an office or at home, I, for one, have had several clients that I've never actually met face to face. I mean, I see them on a Zoom call. And when I finally get together, the first thing they say is, John, I didn't realize you were so tall. I'm 6'3". But you can't tell that. So there's still a certain lack of feeling of connection that I think, again, those who can cut through that are really going to be in better stead as we move out of this. Two other quick things, because, again, I know we're getting tight on time. But another thing on the next slide that jumped out of the last barometer that we did that I think has some impact. I'm questioning whether we are seeing people's faith and confidence in vaccine efficacy waning. It's not meaning, this is not a political statement, and it's not, you're not going to get vaccinated. People certainly have, to the extent that they have. But look at this data, and a drop down for the first time in January of 22 from to less than a majority who believe that the vaccines are effective in keeping Americans healthy. Is that because of all these breakthrough cases with Omicron? Perhaps. At the same time, you've got 69% who say that, after getting the vaccine, someone can still get very sick from Delta or Omicron. You can see it's, forced to choose between whether it's a serious risk or not. 78% say it's serious. Some of this has really got us thinking about, you combine this with people doing activities and still the concern, people are a little bit, they're not as trusting of even the vaccine anymore. And that kind of goes to the last slide that I want to show you guys. And that is what I referenced in the beginning, and that is this whole moving shift of people who don't necessarily see us getting back to normal, at least in one subjective interpretation of what that is. We've been asking since the onset of the barometer, on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 indicates we're right back to where we were in March or February of 20, and a 1 is total lockdown. Where are we going to be at each of these different quarterly junctures? And obviously, we've been asking it throughout time. But look at the shape of these curves. They're all going downwards to the point that right now, you've got 35% of people who in January of 22 say that we'll be up and running as we were pre-pandemic by the end of 22. This is not about life post-COVID. In their minds right now, it's about life with COVID. And as we capture and figure out the best ways to attack life in this environment, the better we're going to be as marketers.
Interesting.
Yeah, so the final thing I'll share, and we do have a little bit of time for some questions, is we just ask people, what do you think 2022 is going to be like for you? And so you see kind of the general themes over there. There's, some general optimism, a focus on self-care, as we talked about, inflation concerns, using time in different ways. I think my favorite one is actually the second individual bullet point. We ask, what do you think life's going to be like in 2022? And it says, cloudy, try again later, which is the line from the Magic 8 Ball, for those of you who would remember that. I thought that perfectly captured the consumer mindset for the coming year. So
that's the 8 Ball, right?
Exactly. Ask the 8 Ball, and it says cloudy, ask again later. So
interesting.
Yeah. So
when
Dan,
I was a kid, I made
questions?
a lot of decisions based on the 8 Ball, Steve. So,
As did we all.
Yeah.
As did we all.
I always used to shake it a couple of times until I got the answer I wanted.
Hey, there's that too,
That's why you run a company now. That's well, Dan, we have some questions.
Yeah, there's a few questions that came in both during registration and here. So I think we have time to answer a couple of these. One question that comes up here that I thought was interesting is, in any of your, John or Steve, the research that you've done, Derek Wilson asks, what's the outlook for brick and mortar businesses that were already affected by the rise of e-com? I know kind of touched about the service industries and struggling to get employees there, but what's the outlook for traditional brick and mortar businesses? John, maybe you have some data on this that you've collected with the barometer.
We do, and I think it's probably really best illustrated in some depth interviews that we were doing at the end of last year and the early part of this year. There's no question that we aren't moving to a world that is going to become increasingly reliant upon digital transactions. We're moving to a world that is much more in line with self-service and self-sufficiency. But that aside, I think everybody in the retail sector has to think back to, how are you differentiating yourself and how are you creating experiences that can't be replicated in those digital environments? Because unless you want to be totally commoditized, that's your one opportunity through a face-to-face experience to really provide that extra sense of service and customer knowledge. And granted, the context within which I'm framing this comes from a number of very high-touch, service-oriented industries. But people, again, think of what we said. They want to be in control, but they also want to claim back certain aspects of that past that are not being fulfilled in more of a constricted environment. So I think brick and mortar selectively still has really huge opportunities if they can deliver that sense of comfort and control to differentiate itself in ways that one never can do digitally. You agree with that, Steve?
Yeah, I do, very much. And I would say that as I look at the numbers, I think you do see some traditional brick and mortar retailers doing well if they've really been able to master omni-channel connections and marketing, kind of give that in-person experience. I mean, if you look overall at websites that have done well, of course, Amazon's up big. Etsy is actually doing well. It's kind of the anti-Amazon. Chewy and Pets. And so those are classic, all digital retailers. But at the same time, Walmart's doing well, Target's doing well, Home Depot's doing well. These big brands that have been able to leverage their brick and mortar footprint and combine it with improvements in digital to give people that kind of experience that they want. So, I think one of the most overstated storylines has been, the retail apocalypse. And people say, well, look at Sears and JCPenney and Kmart. And I'm like, well, yeah, but they also were focused on kind of that great thriving American middle class that isn't there anymore. Mm-hmm. They did a lot of things wrong. It wasn't just because they were brick and mortar retailers. So don't give up on brick and mortar yet, but really fine tune omni-channel marketing.
Cool. I think one more question here, and this is obviously, I think, John, you covered it a little bit around inflation. What are you seeing? Will it continue to trend upward? I know you mentioned that people feel like prices are lower, but inflation's higher. So any predictions on sort of inflation, or if that'll get better or worse as we continue through 2022 here?
I'd like to think and hope that it's got to get better, and a lot of that's really going to be contingent upon what the Fed actually does. Mm-hmm. So, we're in an unprecedented place as it goes to that, and I would hope that action would be taken to address it.
Yeah, I think as the supply chain catches up too, that should help out, right? With the prices getting lower. I know that people don't feel like it, but prices are getting higher, and obviously that's what inflation is measured off of. But I think as the supply chain catches up, probably we'll see flatlining out there. But it's kind of an interesting point that the person brings up and that you bring up as well.
Yeah, I am concerned about the humongous amount of money that our government continues to just print. And we all hear about infrastructure bill. Okay, that sounds great. We all want better infrastructure. How are we going to pay for it? We'll put it on the credit card, basically. And we've put so much on the credit card. I don't have the numbers offhand, but our government is tremendously in debt. So I do worry about the national debt, and at some point those credit card bills are going to come due.
That could be another one of your canary in a coal mine measures, is the national debt, along with the stock market, right?
Yep, very much.
Great. Well, thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate you joining me today. Follow us on all these channels. I know we're all pretty active on these. Hope you all got some good information out of this. If you have questions, feel free to follow up with us individually. We'll try to answer some of these questions too that we weren't able to get to. But with that, thank you very much. And John and Steve, again, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great one.